Good evening. This is Sundiata Chajua with Real Talk History as a Weapon for Black Liberation. Today, our first guest of a new year is Dr. Brian P. Jones. Dr. Jones is the inaugural director of New York Public Library Center for Educators and Schools, and we'll get into a discussion about exactly what he does there and what that center is designed to do. He is the former Associate Director of Education at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Dr. Jones is a longtime member of the Board of Directors of Voices of a People's History of the United States. That's a project that that originated with Howard Zinn and is, I think, a audio portion to a people's history. But Dr. Jones will correct me if I got that wrong. Now, for 9 years, Dr. Jones did that hard, difficult work of teaching elementary grades in New York public schools. Just a moment, I have to take this call. Okay, what's going on, Lisa? Okay. Yeah, we do. At least once. Yeah. Okay. Um. Yeah. No, he won't. We. Let me talk to. Let me get right. Let me get back to you, sis. Okay. Bye. I apologize, but my brother was rushed to the hospital, and I was getting an update. All right. So for 9 years, Dr. Jones did the difficult and poorly remunerated work of being a public school educator in the elementary grades where there are extremely few black male teachers. In 2014, he ran as for lieutenant governor of the state of New York on the Green Party ticket, and he was a member of the International Socialist Organization (ISO) until its dissolution in 2019. And he can talk to us about when he joined, etc. Now, one of the reasons he's here tonight is he's going to talk about this new book that he recently published entitled Tuskegee Student Uprising, A History. Now, I'm sure many of you are saying, a student uprising at Tuskegee? Well, yeah. Wherever there is oppression, there is resistance, right? So let me bring Dr. Jones in. Brother Brian, it's a pleasure to see you. Asante Sana for coming on my podcast, Real Talk, History as a Weapon for Black Liberation on the Black Power Network, Black Power Media Network. Now, I urge you to be comprehensive and succinct. We work in the dialectic here, right? Um, you should be aware that, it's my, I interrupt. I push people for clarification, and sometimes I just make direct challenges, right? We try and keep it interesting and make it a conversation. So you're the star. The guests are the stars. No doubt about that. Now, I was deeply influenced by William E. Cross, the psychologist who developed the negrescence theory, Negro to Black conversion process. And my wife's a psychologist, and she does similar type work. So I'm just into this approach. So I'm always going to begin with trying to get an understanding of who you were and how you became who you are in the political sense, right? So that's what we're concerned with here is politics and ideology. So what I'd like for you to do is discuss experiences, very specific experience. I don't want abstractions. Uh, Mentors, books that you read, influences that helped you develop your political, social, racial, national, economic consciousness. And I want to know what age, what years did you come of age? When was your formative experiences? I want to learn something about the community and neighborhood in which you grew up, because those things shape people, right? Uh, and I want to know your class background, and if those three things and others influenced the development of your political, artistic, because you're also an artist, and racial, political, national consciousness. So open it up.
Okay. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Yes, I
Yeah.
can.
Thank you, Sundiata, for having me on your show. And I just want to say best wishes to your sibling. I hope they're okay. So sorry
Thank
to
you.
hear that they're hospitalized. And I'm glad we're able to have this conversation despite that. So the gist is that, for people who can't see, who might be listening to this but not watching it, I'm a very light-skinned Black man. And my parents both look like me. Both of my parents grew up in all Black segregated communities. And I had a very different experience. You can hear
Which
from
states?
They grew up in Michigan, in the Detroit area.
Mm-hmm.
They went to high school and first met in high school together. Although my mother's formative experiences were really growing up in Nashville, Tennessee. Both of them so I've been trying to trace both sides of both my mother and my father's sides of the family. And I can trace them both back several hundred years in this land before there was a United States to free people of color on both sides. And of course, in Black families, there's all kinds of ways the trail runs cold. But when I was doing that work to try to understand those family roots on both sides, it made me feel even more confident as somebody who has, and not that I wouldn't say that immigrants or, somebody who just arrived today doesn't have, I don't buy the outside agitator thing. I don't believe in that.
Yeah.
But I just want to say that, when that day comes that somebody's going to come for me, I feel like I want to say to them, you know how long my people have been on this land putting up with this? Again, no shade to anybody who just arrived literally this day. I want to be in solidarity with them, but there's something about that history that makes me feel like, makes me feel confident in making whatever critique I want to make as a free person. Of course, you don't get to be this complexion without white folks. However, there are none in the record that I was able to find. There are what are clearly indigenous people. And, there's places like, I'm really into Warren Milteer's work on free people of color in North Carolina.
Yeah,
and from both sides, I can trace them to that kind of North Carolina, Hertford Triangle, that kind of thing.
Okay.
So given our complexions, you could probably guess the rest. Yeah. Like on my mom's side of the family, so we're treated differently. We have a different experience. Yeah. And it's like any Black family, not everybody has this complexion. So there's, you could be at a family reunion, so there's all complexions. I don't want to overstate it, but especially on my mother's side of the family, there's educators going way back. I remember being at my one of my great aunt's 90th birthday party, and she stood up and gave a speech. This is in Detroit, in the Inkster area, and I remember she's giving a speech and joking that she had taught nearly everyone in the room. There's 200 people in the room of all ages. So that's the kind of people that I come from. Both of my parents went to college. I think they both wanted me to make my way in the broader world. They sent me to, so as I got older, to specialized schools and this sort of thing. So I've always been somebody who is moving in different kinds of spaces, not just Black spaces. And frankly, to be perfectly honest, a whole bunch of my formative years were in predominantly white spaces, and you could hear it in my voice. So I found my way to the Black radical tradition, and it is, as an adult, it's been a tradition of thought that is just held my attention, and so I've followed that interest.
So when you say as an adult, you mean during your college years or post-college?
Well, actually, in high school.
In high school, okay.
A couple of things happened.
Not as an adult.
There were not. Oh, well, a young adult. There were students who none of this was on the curriculum. It was a really Eurocentric curriculum. But I remember one of the, very few Black students. I went to this all boys for high school. I went to an all boys private high school. I am grateful for it because it gave me certain equipment, and it stimulated and gave room for a kind of intellectual blossoming that I was like I was a middle class kid, but basically I was a poor kid in this kind of a context.
In that context, yeah.
In that context, I didn't have a big home. We didn't take European vacations. Like I wasn't living the kind of life that my classmates were living. And I studied Latin and Greek. But one of the Black students, one day passed me something. He's like, "You need to listen to this." And I graduated from high school in 1991. So this is like late 80s, early 90s. And it was Public Enemy, Fear of a Black Planet.
Fear of a Black Planet. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And I think he was kind of saying to me, like,
formative text.
He was like, "Brother, man, you need to listen to this." And so sure enough, I wore out that cassette tape. But I had never, that was like, ooh, and it's language and it's ideas, and you're right, it's a text. I mean, there's full of ideas and references and people to look up and like, well, who is that they're talking about? What do they mean by that? So that was a formative text. Then another incident, a student passed me a copy of the autobiography of Malcolm X with the same words. "You need to read this." And when I read
let me
that,
jump in here, man.
Please go ahead.
I've had so many people. I've had people from Bill Fletcher and my generation to younger people. I mean, folks in their early 30s. And what do they say? The autobiography of Malcolm X was transformative for me. So go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's true. So I think that what this kind of Black, and to be honest, because I'm, in a middle class Black home, I have access to other kind of like bougie Black things, like Jack and Jill and things like that did not speak to me in the same way that these kind of radical texts did. And so when I went to college, I decided to study theater, which is where the theater performance background comes in. And I thought that I would do theater as a way of changing the world, that that's what my kind of mission would be. I figured that people who were studying theater were kind of out of the box thinkers, or that we would be the people. To me, theater was implicitly a kind of imaginative space in which you would stand aside from society and be lob criticism, jokes, humor. Like, you would be, there would be a point, a purpose that would be a social purpose, and that I would be among the free thinkers, not the people who were like the corporate drones or what have you. And unfortunately, the more, and I relished my experience in the theater, but I wouldn't trade my theater education, much like my high school education, just warped and strange as it was an applied education. We were constantly making plays, writing plays, directing plays, producing plays, acting in plays. It was an applied education. So I really relished that. But as I tried to figure out a way to do more politically with my plays, first of all, I wasn't good at it. I struggled.
As an actor or as a writer?
as a writer, producer, director, I tried to, I'm going to make something bold and daring and whatever. And it was not good, is my assessment looking back on it. But, I was trying. And I guess the feeling I had, the more there was a moment where frankly, I was walking across the main campus square, and suddenly I was in the middle of the largest protest I'd ever seen. Hundreds of students were occupying the main administrative building, and they were demanding financial aid, increased financial aid for minority students, and need-blind admissions. That the school be blind at the moment of application as to your need as an applicant.
Okay.
And that they therefore just admit you based on your qualifications. And if they then reveal your need,
they
and
would
it turns out
provide all of it.
They are on the hook to figure out how to make it work for you, rather than being able to take that. So those were their demands. Now, once again, just like in high school, I was in a very elite school. I went to Brown University, and I was in a space where I was, it feels strange to say, but I was among the poorer of my classmates. And so I was working while going to school. I couldn't party on Fridays because Saturday morning I had to be up at 6 a.m. to make donuts in the cafeteria, kind of thing. And my wife reminded me recently that one of my jobs there was at a research library. I was shelving books at one of the research libraries on campus. So I was like, never occurred to, and here I am back at the library. Anyway, that's a whole other story. But the point is that seeing this movement, I'd never been a part of the movement. I was not reading newspapers, but seeing this movement, it was led by students of color, very clearly and obviously. Black students, Latino students, other students of color were in the leadership of this movement that was like 100 strong. In that moment, I just instinctively was like, well, yes, of course. Like, of course we need these things. And so I went back to my theater people and I said, hey, do you know about this movement? There's this big movement. It's happening right now. What can we do? What can we do to lend our thing? Like, this is our chance. This is our chance to take all these resources and use them for this. And the response was so frosty and cold, and nobody had the kind of basic gut reaction that, like, nobody had like, yes, of course, falling off. It was all but like, well, but the school does have to figure out how to balance their budgets and yada yada. I was like, and I suddenly realized that I was not in the right place. And I didn't know where my right place was. And so trying to find a place with people who would have that same gut that I did is what first led me to the socialist movement, to people whose attitude towards the world was that this is all wrong and it's all upside down. And they were particularly interested in the Black radical tradition and celebratory of it. And so, they were also.
Let me cut in. Let me cut in here, Brian. There's something that you had imbibed in your environment that made you open, because your response to Fear of a Black Planet, your response to the demonstration, your response to Malcolm's autobiography is too guttural and immediate. So why do you think you were open to that? Because I can assure you that there were other people from your same background who weren't.
I think, maybe it was that, maybe part of it was that, I come from a very proud family, so I fear that to say anything further I don't want to say anything that would represent them in a way they don't want to be represented. But let me just say this. I know you don't want generalities, but let me just say this, that my parents did divorce when I was very young, and so I lived with my mother. And watching her struggles and, very much identifying with her and feeling, of course I'm rooting for her, and I'm kind of seeing the world as a young person through her eyes, and seeing how she as a Black woman is treated as she's trying to navigate the white world and kind of rise in a hierarchy and do all the things that people try to do so they can make a living and feed their children, etc. I think that I came to feel that, and then also being in school spaces where people had so much and that we didn't have, and seeing how hard my mother was working, and then seeing other people who just seemed to just have and have and have, when, what they had was, I don't know, it just seemed unfair to me. And so maybe it's some of that. And then that there was so much when I would kind of raise my hand and pose a question, that it would be, not always, because I had some great teachers, some wonderful teachers, but sometimes the teachers and classmates also just seemed to see me as a kind of alien. There's one incident where one of the Black students, and there were, again, very few in high school, but one of them had this thing where somebody wrote N-word, go home, spray painted that inside his locker and hung a noose. So, and there was nothing was done. Nothing was done. Nothing. I think they, made him say sorry or something. They figured out who it was and then just made him apologize. And I was like, wait, what? Like, I just felt that it was, and then he was like walking around laughing, joking, like he was just back to whatever. And I was like, but that's like, he went nuclear and you just gave him a little slap on the wrist. So not that I had all the solutions about what should have happened, but it just felt insufficient. So I convinced my best friend at the time to go to school the next day wearing black armbands. And so he and I were the only ones in this whole school. He was really reluctant to do this, but I was like, basically put our friendship on the line. I was like, you do this or we're done. So he did it. We put on the black armbands and we go to school. And I'll never forget one of the teachers being like, oh, Jones, they like to call me Jones. Yeah. Jones, what are you starting a revolution here? What are you doing? And it was like, that was the kind of thing. It was like, wasn't taken seriously. So somehow, I don't know how to answer your question, but
No, you have.
I felt this like gut thing going on that I didn't have a lot of like equipment for. I didn't have language for. I didn't have resources for. I didn't have frameworks for.
But you had a sensitivity too, and you had developed a sense of justice and a sense of, my situation, the class background is much, much, much lower, but my mother worked as a nurse and she was part of that first wave, or maybe the second wave of Black women to become nurses in my community. And she would come home and she's talking to my grandmother and her sisters, but what I'm hearing is she's trying to give this old white guy a bath, and he's screaming, "Get this nigga out of there!"
Yeah.
They're spitting on her, and while I didn't know how to process it, what I knew is that it put something in me to be resistant to white folk, right? So that's what I'm hearing from you, is that you had that sensitivity, and then once you got some equipment and a language, you take off.
Yeah. And I think that another thing that I was inspired by was I was inspired by Dr. King. I did not know what a radical he was, of course. I only knew the kind of like mainstream presentation of him, but and the clips of the speeches that are usually played. But even that is still powerful and affecting stuff. And I think there's like, sometimes I still tear up just hearing his voice, because there's something magnanimous about him and what he kind of stood for and represented, that I saw as a kind of apex of the way one might view people and relate to them. And so I was not, it's not true to say that I was like a race man, you know, or something like that. I was, it was a different view. And I think that, to me, the Black radical tradition, part of what I find so inspiring about it, frankly, is that, to me, at its best, it's offering something to everyone if they will listen to it. And a lot of people won't and can't hear it. But at its best, it's actually offering something to the human race, I think, that is really, really important. And that's why I keep coming back to it.
But you know, here's what I would say. I think that there's been a misreading of the Black nationalist tradition. I think that even in its worst personification, and we'll just read in here, Nation of Islam, there is a breadth and a humanism that is often overlooked, because the Nation of Islam, given their faulty historical interpretation, they believe that they were Asiatic Black men and women, right? And they spoke in terms of the Asiatic Black man and woman, and that becomes 7/8 of the globe, right? And so I think that there's a lot of humanism in that tradition, even when we're not talking about revolutionary Black nationalism, which is obviously an advance of that kind of bourgeois nationalism. But that bourgeois Black nationalism isn't as steeped in racism and anti-humanism as it's often given credit for.
That's a good point.
Let's. I really appreciate your willingness to go deep and, you know, pull up those stories, because I think my audience in particular appreciates notions of learning how one becomes conscious. I might even say the word woke and let the Republicans come after us. So here, man, look, you came to academia after a career as a public educator and a history of movement activism. But even given all of that, your choices of not to join the professoriate in a traditional way, but to in fact engage in public education, right, is unusual. So explain to me why the choice, Social Director Schomburg for Education, directing this Center for Educators and Schools. Why did you take this path? Because clearly you had other options.
Well, that's nice of you to say. And this is a question that it's funny. I think we all are, as a species, we need stories. Stories are really, we understand ourselves in some ways as a story. And so let me create a story about how this all makes sense and how it all fits together.
But it's post facto.
Yeah. But I'll try to be as honest as I can. But I'm narrating myself, really, is what I'm doing. But the way I remember it is that first of all, I think in general you could say, "Oh, you didn't go into the professoriate. What a strange choice. Why'd you make that strange choice?" It was strange choices all along. When I got out of college, my first job was I had a moving company. It was just me and my buddy, and we were movers. Okay, so that was choice number one. So I've literally had like 17 jobs before I became a teacher. So there's this whole prehistory of me as this living on a cot, trying to be a full-time activist and living very hand to mouth, and then realizing that I was that I needed to sink deeper roots and be more I needed to have a better setup just for my own personal health and to be a different kind of person in the world. And of course, I was always drawn to teaching, and because of my family, in the summers back home in Cleveland, I would teach at a summer arts camp for little kids. So I was always drawn to that kind of work. So then it was many years after college that I went back to do a master's at City College at CUNY in Harlem to become a teacher, and then was really lucky to get several, first one and then a few other teaching gigs in public schools in Harlem, which was an amazing, I'm not from Harlem, and suddenly I'm teaching in Harlem. And so that was an enormous education from the students.
This is early 2000s?
Early 2000s, at the same moment that they're trying to pull the rug out from under public education.
That's right.
And there's a movement.
Bullshit.
Yeah, and Harlem was ground zero for this. Harlem was ground zero. Ideologically, financially, I mean, everything was just coming together in Harlem in a very forceful way. So then suddenly all this activism I had been doing as a kind of rootless, person just inserting themselves in wherever I could. I mean, and I worked on many different issues, union issues, the death penalty, you name it. But suddenly I was very rooted in something that was a huge political issue. But to be honest, I didn't understand it. I didn't understand where this is coming from, what this is about. Why are they doing this? Why do they seem to be so concerned with Harlem? Why are they aiming
Were
their fire?
You not in a political organization at that point? You weren't in ISO?
I was, but I thought that the struggle was going to be over like school supplies and class sizes and like some, I don't know. I was kind of imagining that we're going to try to get smaller class sizes. We're going to try to get the school supplies we need. I didn't imagine that the person, the chancellor of the school, the person in charge of the public school system would try to undermine the school. It's almost like if you
I got you. Yeah.
It's like the postmaster general was trying to give the store away to FedEx, or something like that. I was like, what's going on? And then I didn't understand. And then the way they were, and then suddenly, I was trained in this socialist tradition to see the racism as this like weapon of the employers to divide the working class, right? Like that's the analysis. Yeah. But this was something else. This was like, these people were saying they were the civil rights movement. This was a kind of like language of anti-racism. So that's what I'm saying. Yeah. It was like, well, wait a minute, what's happening here? Actually, they're talking staunchly about inequality and zip code not being your destiny and all, they have this like strident, almost like strident social justice message, but whose impact, and because I'm teaching in Harlem, many of my coworkers are Black. Many of them are senior to me. They've been at this for decades.
Yeah.
They've had a deep commitment to the community, deep commitment to the students. They taught the students. They taught their parents. Like they are really rooted in a way that I was not. I was becoming over time, getting to know people and families and getting involved in community issues and meeting with parents and sometimes organizing with parents as a teacher.
Did you move into Harlem?
I lived, where did I live? I lived in, I think my first apartment that I rented was in Washington Heights. And then I never lived south of like 165th Street.
Okay.
So I was in like Washington Heights basically the whole time.
Okay.
And then teaching in Harlem. I couldn't afford to live in Harlem.
Yeah. That's when the gentrification was insane at that point.
Yeah. Anyway, I forgot your question, but this was like this became a whole other wave of my political development, was trying to understand what was happening, trying to use the activist and socialist and other tools that I had to think about what was going on. And I was rooted in a Black context where there were Black people on both sides of the issue. And therefore, it wasn't just Black people versus white people. It was something deeper was going on.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what led me. I mean, really, though, this story is what led me to write this book, actually, because that's what led me to the idea of Black education history, that there's a history to this pattern. And
is that what sends you back to grad school?
it was losing so many battles is what sent me back to grad school. We fought co-locations, we fought school closures. I mean, we were protesting at committee meetings. The committee that runs the schools, we were protesting at those meetings. We were kind of really anywhere we were showing up at, any community council we could show up at and make a protest, we were doing it. And after a while, but we lost most of the battles is the reality. And it really was taking a toll on me, on my colleagues. It was demoralizing. And a wonderful scholar by the name of Jean Anion, who unfortunately has passed, was on a panel with me. And she was a professor at the CUNY Graduate Center, and we just struck up a conversation, and she started talking to me about what it would mean to go be a graduate student. And with her encouragement, I decided to take that plunge.
So my question to you is, given that background, and I want to pull the thread of being an actor, because, and I may be misreading your personal history, but I got the impression that was still something that was central to what you do in your identity, and that's what the connection to the voices of a people's history is about. How do you put the pieces together of doing both physical and voice acting with being a historian and your movement work? Because in my sense, I don't run into many people who are schizophrenic, meaning that they got multiple identities. Most people harmonize their identifications into a core identity that is coherent for them.
Yeah. No, your psychological guess that there's some schizophrenia going on here is, I don't want to make light of people who actually suffer from schizophrenia. Forgive me, I don't want to make light. But the truth is that since the dissolution of the organization that I was in for a long time, being in an organization, there's so many strengths to it. It gives you a framework. It's you have debates and you have discussions, but you kind of are operating within a coherent framework, or you're hoping that it's coherent. The dissolution of that organization, which for me, it came at a moment when, and it was obviously, as you might imagine, fed by the struggles of that organization to move its ideas forward, which then leads to a kind of crisis of confidence in the project and people rethinking it and yada, yada. So for me, having the opportunity to go to graduate school, try to study more deeply, think more deeply about all the things I've been thinking about, everything up to that point, like, okay, I'm going to read all the books. I'm going to try to understand what I've just lived through, this war zone that I just lived through. I'm going to try to understand it. And then when the organization went away, well, now I'm just Ronin. I'm just like a guy without a direction. And that's when I was a scholar in residence at the Schomburg Center, finishing my dissertation. And so this kind of gets back to your question about why that choice? Well, because I was at the Schomburg Center. And if anybody your listeners don't understand, it is a mecca of Black history and politics and culture. It is a true crossroads of many different, really a diasporic vision of Blackness and what Black people think and do and feel and see and create and contribute to the world. And of course, part of that, not all of it, but part of that is that it is a place that welcomes, among many other voices that it welcomes, I want to be clear, among many other voices that it welcomes, which I'm guessing you and people on the Black left would strongly disagree with those voices, but among them, there is a place and a welcome for people from the Black radical tradition. And so being there and being somebody who feels comfortable picking up a book and reading it and getting curious and has always kind of turned to books and writing and intellectual work as a way to kind of find myself again when I felt lost, to always go back to reading as a kind of way to ground myself. That's always been my strategy in life. To be in that kind of a library where, you know, sometimes you're kind of looking for a book that's like an old book from the Black radical tradition and nobody has it. The Schomburg has it. So, you know, that book that you can never find anywhere else, you ask them and then a few minutes later it's in your hands. And then you're reading that book. And then you're realizing, oh my God, this person is citing this other thing. And then you ask for that book and then that book is in your hands. And like, if you want to go down that kind of rabbit hole, as I was wanting to do and wanting to feed myself with that, that was an amazing place to be. And then you come up for air and you wander over to the auditorium and there's somebody giving a lecture. There's Imani Perry, you know, there's, you know, name your person. There's Robin D.G. Kelly. There's people, there's Barbara Smith. Like, suddenly, even if you haven't read the books, you're getting a taste of what it is that they have to say and are putting out in the world firsthand by seeing them speak. Because
so let me ask you a question. Does your reading change after the dissolution of the organization? And I would imagine that, you know, organizations don't collapse on one day, that there's generally years of unraveling. Was there a moment, and I don't know how to characterize this, but where more of the reading was fewer Black authors, and then it shifts, and while it's what my good friend Sharice calls radical Blackness, and I think it's similar, but we don't want to get into that. Did it shift more toward that and away from something else? And then you had to make sense of the two different literature bases?
Absolutely. I always, as I was building a radical library as an activist, you know, I was moving from place to place with more books than anything else. In my slender, modest homes and apartments and rooms I rented or whatever, it was always a lot of books and like a little cot that I was sleeping on. But yes, in that library was lots of European revolutionary history and, you know, European revolutionaries and activists and thinkers. And always, because I had the opportunity and the organization I was in had the interest, I also, you know, discovered the radical side of King and read up on that and followed those threads of the labor movement and, you know, deeper in time, especially Black American history and social movement history, and pulling on those threads. That was, you know, a great pleasure of mine and something that I drew a lot of strength and ideas from. But yes, the dissolution, the occasion of being at the Schomburg Center, a logical thing to do, and the choice that I made was to focus my reading then in the Black tradition and more or less in those topics. And then to get back to your question about why a job there, well, frankly, because I was on the job market, and yes, you know, as you say, I did have other prospects, but, you know, I was not 22 coming out of graduate school. You know, I was, I started graduate school at 39. You know, I already had a child when I started graduate school. And by the time I was finishing up at the Schomburg Center, I had a second. So I was not a spring chicken. And to start at the kind of be an assistant professor and like work my way up that ladder just didn't seem like the best use of my time. And honestly, but that's the only thing I'd prepared myself for mentally. I was very excited to be a professor of education. I'm going to teach about the kind of history and politics. You're going into the teaching profession, and I'm going to arm you to understand the political battles that have shaped this institution, school, the way educators and parents and students, particularly, I'm going to teach you about Black education history and the way that very consistently over a long period of time, Black people have fought for access to and equity in spaces of learning, equated learning and liberation for a long time. And no matter what you are, whether you're Black or not, I think there's so much you can take from that tradition of Black people's approach to learning and liberation. That's who I was going to be. I was going to be that professor. And it was only when I was at the Schomburg that suddenly I just had the idea that maybe an amazing thing would be to stay there, to not leave, to stay there. And so out of curiosity, I went on the library's website and looked at the job listings. And if anything I'm saying is sounding resonant, like, wow, Brian, the library sounds like an amazing place to work. It is. And I recommend that you do the same thing that I did. Go on the New York Public Library's website. Schomburg Center is part of New York Public Library. And look at their jobs. And there are some amazing jobs. So, and frankly, now that I've become more integrated into the library's ecosystem and met more people, I realize actually the library has collected a lot of really brilliant people. I'm in good company. Not just people with PhDs, but people who are really smart and who are intellectually very alive and multi-talented. So there was a job, associate director of education, and then just things shifted in my brain and suddenly I just started to imagine a whole different future for myself that was stepping, and it was very scary to do. It was very scary to leave teaching. You know, I was 9 years in, there's a pension, there's a pay scale, I have a child, like I had a lot of things in place. It's very scary to leave that and go be a graduate student, which is very economically vulnerable. You're dependent on grants and professors, and you know, you're hustling. You're like, it's very entrepreneurial. So I kept taking these leaps though, and I'm very fortunate that it, knock wood, it's so far kind of worked out. So I took the leap to be grad student. Then I stepped off. So in some ways, being a grad student was stepping off of the train that I was on. And then, so it's actually maybe one way to narrate this is that I keep doing this. I keep getting on a train and stepping off the train. So I got
taking the next one that appears to be going further.
Right.
Look, so, I want to get to some things. So, Mary Frances Berry, VP Franklin, myself, we've got the book, the edited collection coming out from University of Illinois Press, Reparations and Repertory Justice, Past, Present, and Future. And you've got an essay in there entitled The Socialist Case for Reparations. Now, why do we have to make the case to socialists? And what is the case that you're making?
And so, you know, it's interesting, since we're speaking so frankly about all of these things, you know, remember we first had a dialogue about a piece I wrote for Jacobin on that topic, which is like, I don't know if you have this experience, but I certainly do, which is that I always look back at anything, even if I wrote it 5 minutes ago, but I look back at old things and often cringe. And so there's a lot of things that are out there that I think are great. And I still like, oh, wow, I'm proud that I wrote that. But there's some things that have cringy qualities to them in tone, in ways of making an argument, in ways of speaking about people. So I don't love that Jacobin piece, but I appreciate that you wanted me to develop the argument. And so, you know, back in 2019, when I was still part of the socialist movement, I wrote that piece that's going to appear in the book, and I'm glad it's going to be out in the world. But you know, it represents a kind of moment of thought in 2019 that I think still holds up. But the germ
in accordance with organizational ideology, or were you a heretic?
Yeah, I think so. No, I don't think I was a heretic on that point.
Okay,
but I was in disagreement with other people, even, you know, some Black scholars in the socialist movement broadly, who I speak about in the article, who kind of took the position, more of like a Bernie Sanders kind of position, that the thing to do is call for, you know, it's called for Medicare for all, and, you know, kind of things that are for everyone, universal programs, and And of course, obviously I'm for, maybe it's not obvious, but I am for those kind of programs. I do think everyone should have universal health care. And if it's not clear, let me say for the record that, here I am in my home, it's nighttime, and I'm speaking as an individual, not on behalf of my employer or anything like that. This is me as an individual. I think we should have some kind of universal healthcare program. Absolutely. So I support that slogan.
But you take the king position, which was for universal things for everyone in the society, with an emphasis on the working class, and in addition, compensatory measures for Black folk.
Absolutely.
And other people and other racially oppressed folk.
And I think that the spirit of solidarity demands it. It is the old socialist slogan: an injury to one is an injury to all. It's not that an injury to all is an injury to all. It's that an injury to one is an injury to all. So that means if they come for trans people, and I'm not trans, which I'm not, then my duty is to speak up in their defense. And if I don't, because speaking up in their defense is not a universal slogan or something that applies to everyone in a kind of immediate universal way, then that's not the spirit.
Yeah.
It's not the spirit of the slogan, actually. And I think that the kind of solidarity we need to make a deeper, bigger change in our societies for people to develop that instinct and learn to respond with energy and force and strength to the idea of an injury to one. And we've seen brilliant moments of that, in my view, that just continue to inspire me. The 2020 uprisings was a multiracial uprising in this country in that summer. That was a multiracial uprising that, in fact, arguably, the unifying slogan of the radicalizing youth of this country, oddly, was not Medicare for all. But the thing that brought everyone to the streets, the young people, the multiracial radicalizing young people, the slogan on their lips was Black Lives Matter.
That's right.
That to me was an amazing advance and an expression of solidarity. That is the kind of expression.
C.L.R. James would say that it has, for much of American history, been that way. That we have been that dynamic, crystallizing agent whose particularities have spoken to the universal.
Yeah. So that's the spirit of that argument. It's just me kind of, and that's why, even though I'm not, I can't authentically claim to be a kind of person speaking from within the socialist movement. And if anybody wanted to say, who's this guy? He hasn't been on a picket line. What is, why should we listen to him? Well, then, frankly, that's a valid criticism. I have to own that this is, but I think
criticisms have to be particular to an argument. I don't think that you have to have a track record to make a valid argument.
Okay, well, thank you. But I do think the ideas in the piece hold up, and I'm glad it's going to see the light of day.
Good. So let's turn to a major accomplishment in your life, and I think it will be a work that will have impact, and that's the Tuskegee Student Uprising, A History. Now, I know some people are saying an uprising of students at Tuskegee. Yeah. All right, so look, I enjoyed reading it. In addition to be well written, it tells a good story, but it engages really big questions. And so one of the things that I'm intrigued by is that you seem to accept the internal colonial or domestic neocolonial thesis. And so I want to read a quote to you and just have you react to that. So on page 99, you state, second, while the global context of decolonization and national liberation, especially in Africa, gave Black students in all regions of the country, meaning the U.S., the inspiration, the language, and the tools of analysis to understand their situation in the Deep South, the colonial analogy was particularly apt, especially in Macon County, where Black people outnumbered white people 4-1. Now, immediately, I started thinking about an article that James Boggs had published in this collection he did on racism and the class struggle. And the article was "The City is the Black Man's Land." And I don't want to, be reductionist here, but is your argument about the colonial situation being particularly apt in the Deep South, is that tied to demography? And even if it is about demography, what would you say about Detroit, East St. Louis, Illinois, and other overwhelmingly Black industrial, well, formerly industrial
Yeah.
in the North during that time
Yeah.
period?
I think, thank you for this question. Appreciate the close read. I think that essentially what I was trying to do in this passage and in this whole section of the book is less, and I could see how you could interpret it as me taking a stance that is, here's why this is apt, therefore it all makes sense, and like yada yada, and therefore I'm endorsing the concept. It's more
Well, that's why I
like
said streaming. See, I'm not sure that you are endorsing the concept.
Yeah. I'm actually not.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to do is understand why it made sense to them, and try to say, here's why it made sense. Here's why they would take that up. Here's why, while others are taking it up, arguably, in some way, shape, or form, you could see why it made even more sense to people in this context, and why it would resonate in this context in a way that it might not in others, or even more strongly here than there. So that's what I'm taking up. But I'm very much also guided by the, which I cite as well, the work of Manning Marable, who grew up in the town, taught there briefly, and followed the analogy, but through to the kind of post-colonial moment, where he said, oh, isn't this interesting? If you look at the fate of, and just to make sure your audience understands what we're talking about the idea where Black people have these overwhelming numbers at the same moment of African liberation and new nations throwing off European colonialism. The whole idea of throwing off colonialism, of grabbing political power, wielding state power on behalf of the Black majority, the idea of that as like the crucial next step in transforming social life is, that's still with us, but it's a wildly popular idea that is wrapped up in the radicalism of what's happening on the African continent, and is inspiring people in the United States. And so a lot of people, as I think you're leading me towards, there's a lot of criticisms of the colonial analogy in the United States in ways that it doesn't map. And then there's others who argue that it does map, and that it's, it was a useful set of tools. So all I'm recording here is like, as the historian, like noting that this is what they thought. They were grabbing language. They were grabbing tools from this. Here's why it resonated. And then I followed up actually later in the book with talking about the way some observers who, and by the way, they're successful. They elect the first Black sheriff in the South since Reconstruction. The Black radical students, or radicalizing students at Tuskegee, actually supersede the political activism of their elders, who had been previously very successful in campaigning for voting rights. The students go even further, and they elect a Black sheriff and eventually a Black mayor, and they herald this whole coming of Black people capturing political power in the town. But it feels, when I was set foot in the town in 2014, 2015, 2016, and talking to people, it felt like kind of Pyrrhic victory, where so much of what had been the economic engine of the town had kind of ripped away, and so Black power was like, felt like a hollow victory, like it wasn't a complete victory. So radicals like Manning Marable argued that actually this was similar, oddly, to the post-colonial struggles in Africa, that these newly liberated nations were still in the grip of a global system, and that therefore the new African leaders of newly independent nations were, they, in relation to their populations, were in a kind of trap that actually resembled the struggles of many towns where Black people were elected. And then you could look at Nathan Connolly and many other scholars who've really tracked this well and described how all over the United States, Detroit, Cleveland, I mean, you name it. It was like Black mayors. It was a transformative moment. It was a kind of Obama moment. It was a moment when we thought like, wow, everything is going to change now. And it didn't work out that way. And so, this is me trying to not skip ahead to it not working out, trying to understand why it made sense and why it was inspiring vision at that time. And then I try to apply the later tools later to, working with the ideas of Marable and others to try to understand what happened.
I am a proponent of the internal domestic neocolonial thesis. I think Robert Allen got it right. And I think that what we've witnessed from Ronald Reagan's election down to today was the unraveling of the colonial relationship, i.e. Black people took local state power, and that what the Republicans have been pursuing ever since is to sharply reduce Black people's local state power, as well as we've seen capital reduce the power of the local state. So I think that's right. But I think that I got that you weren't endorsing the theory, that you weren't an advocate, right? But you were saying that when you look at it from this angle that they were engaged in, it made sense. So that's why I was coming at you. Why would it make more sense to activists in Tuskegee than it would make to activists in Detroit?
Right. Well, actually, let me say something more about that, actually, because here are some of the ways that Tuskegee was special. And some of this has been lost to memory, but was very vivid in the archival sources that I used and also in the interviews. I interviewed more than 21 people, as you say, as you noted in your email to me, 15 of them were former students.
Yeah.
Tuskegee in the middle of the 20th century was a really unique Black community. I tried to pin this down in a kind of comparative sense and was unable to do it. But so let me qualify what I'm going to say by saying it might have been the largest concentration of Black professionals, like per square foot, anywhere in the country at that time, in the middle of the 20th century. You have 2,000 people with advanced degrees in a very relatively small space. They are employed as professors. Don't forget about the Tuskegee Airmen. That required pilot training, requires people who are mechanics and engineering. You have 2 hospitals, including a veterans hospital, where you have Black doctors and Black nurses. You have the medical professionals. So you have this enormous professional class who are, that's different than, and you have the burgeoning Black middle class in Detroit and other places, but there's something about the concentration. There's something about the concentration. And then there's the fact that this is not DC, this is not Detroit, this is Alabama. Not just any part of Alabama, this is the Black Belt. Because always you have the middle class around the HBCUs, but this is in the Black Belt. So you have people who are dirt poor farmers just a hop and a skip off campus. And then you have people with their own automobiles, PhDs, speak several languages.
I wish you had done that in a couple of pages over, because that clears up everything for me now. But I think you left it a bit to the reader to either have that information and bring it to bear.
Okay.
And it's true that there are other places in the book where some of that is distilled, but at that moment, I didn't get it. That might say something about my ability to read. Go from there.
Okay.
So let me come back and get another piece of that puzzle, and that's the global piece. Throughout the book, you're constantly talking about the student uprising in '68 in Tuskegee as part of what's happening within the U.S. empire in terms of the Black revolt. But you also are talking about a global revolt that is African and Asian and the people of North and South, Central Americas, the Caribbean. It's well, shit. You said it. It's global, right? But I never got the sense that tied that you laid out the nature of 1968 as a global event. You know, I mean, that year is generally understood as a year of rebellion, a year of revolution, and even across Europe, capitalist foundations are being shook.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So, can you say something about how Tuskegee fit in that global framework?
Absolutely. You know, I think that one of the ways you can see it is actually because of the connection to the military. That because of the celebrated pilot training program and the the Tuskegee Airmen, that program represents a shift away from the earlier model of like the Carnegies and the kind of old philanthropists, and towards a reliance on a deeper integration with the state and particularly the U.S. military. And that always has the, basically through the military, you scooping people up and involving them in global politics very personally, risking their lives in the global arena. And so there's a way in which it inevitably comes back home. In 1966, as you know, a Navy veteran and Tuskegee student who was involved in the movement, had joined with SNCC and was, a comrade of people like James Foreman, Sammy Young Jr. was murdered just off campus in an incident involving a segregated bathroom, murdered by a white gas station attendant. And the fact of his murder off campus instantly resonated with that global context. You see, civil rights movement was mostly kind of silent on the question of Vietnam because they were trying to be in an allegiance with Johnson. Johnson was
They were silent on international questions.
Yes,
mainly.
But it's the occasion of the murder of a Tuskegee student that broke that silence. Actually, the first civil rights organization to issue a formal statement opposing the war in Vietnam was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And if you read that statement, I forget how many times they mention Sammy Young's name, but they mention him by name several times, and they compare him to the Vietnamese. It's not just a peace statement. It's not just peace, we should cease fighting. It's that it's actually in favor of the official enemy and endorsing their struggle and saying that Sammy Young is like them. He's fighting for freedom in the Black Belt of Alabama, just like the Vietnamese are fighting for freedom, for their freedom. And that in both cases, it names the US government apparatus as the enemy of that freedom struggle. I mean, that's more than just an anti-war statement.
No, absolutely.
It's a very forceful statement, and it's occasioned by the murder. So there's a way in which, I guess, to answer your question, it's that Tuskegee
Brian,
Oh, I'm sorry.
I got to cut you off, and I got to end the show. I just got an urgent call about my brother.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Well, I hope he's well.
Brother, we'll pick this up at some other point. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.